Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Adam Hutchings. I'm a health economist. I'm managing director of a consultancy called Dolon. We specialize in rare diseases. And my sort of specialist topic is on the innovation of medicines in cell and gene, in rare diseases, including cell and gene therapies. So the question that I wanted to sort of address today, following on from what we just heard from Frederick, is how do you make cell and gene therapies economically sustainable? How do you encourage innovation in Europe? And to my mind, it's very difficult to answer that question unless you sort of know how it is that companies make the decisions about which diseases to invest in, what sort of technologies, where they're going to put their investors' money. So maybe just to address that question first, what is necessary for innovation to happen in any diseases? And I'd say there's two parts to that answer. The first is there needs to be clinical viability. So ultimately, at a very early stage, when you're developing a medicine, you need to have some hope that there's the possibility that that treatment can change patients' lives. There needs to be unmet need in those disease areas. There needs to be some sort of innovativeness about the science, and there needs to be some possibility you can develop it and commercialize it safely. And I think in the case of cell and gene therapies and ATMPs, it's very clear that that clinical viability or clinical potential is there. I think everyone recognizes the transformative potential that these could have, the impact it could have at a societal level, a public health level, if this technology fulfills its potential. The second thing that's necessary, the more complex bit maybe, is around the economic viability. Certainly the bit that's discussed less frequently. And if a company is going to invest in an early stage technology, they need some confidence that ultimately they will be able to deliver a return on that investment to their shareholders. And it's quite difficult to assess economic viability. To briefly just explain how companies do think about that at that very early stage in product development, this visual kind of helps to show what the maths of that decision look like. So basically, this is a timeline from, on the left-hand side, the point of making a decision to invest in a new medicine, and then going out in years to the far right-hand side where your product loses its patent and you no longer make any revenue. And then what we have above the line is your forecasted revenue from the product if it successfully gets approved. And under the line, we have the red stuff, which is the cost that you're going to have to spend in order to get that product approved and to keep it on the market. And very quickly, the way that you would sort of try and do this forecast is you estimate the potential revenue, which is a factor of how many patients would receive the medicine, the potential price per patient, and then how much duration of patent you would expect to have over which to get a return. So that's the revenue. Incidentally, the number of patients is not the ostensible prevalent population that you've seen in an epidemiology study. It's how many patients actually are diagnosed and receive your medicines, which can be starkly different. Then the second thing we need to estimate is how long it takes to get to the market. How much time is it going to take to develop your therapy? And then you have to estimate the cost. So how much is it going to cost you to do all the studies or the R&D or the preclinical work to get to a point where you can submit to the regulators? And then how much is it going to cost you to manufacture the product, to distribute it, to do all the ongoing clinical studies, or the ongoing safety requirements, or the regulatory, everything that's required to function as a biopharmaceutical company. So it's pretty hard, incidentally, to estimate all this stuff, 20, 25 years down the road, but someone has to try and do it. And once you've done it, you subtract the red cost from the green revenue. And then if the green is more than the red, then yeah, that looks like a promising innovation maybe from an economic perspective. Well, yes, but the final thing you have to do is to adjust for the risk, because it's exceedingly risky developing any sort of medicine, including cell and gene therapies. And there's approximately a 1 in 10 probability that you will be successful from the start of clinical trials. So you have to reduce your future revenue by a factor of 10. You also reduce your future costs by a factor of 10, because if you fail, you're not going to spend those monies. But what you don't reduce so much is all the R&D costs and development costs that you have to spend money on to find out whether or not you're going to be successful. And it probably doesn't surprise you to understand that once you've done this adjustment for risk, and indeed you've discounted it all back to the present, many medicines and therapies suddenly look very marginal from an economic perspective, and the decision becomes much more challenging about whether or not it's something that you can justify investing your investors' money in. So what does this picture look like for cell and gene therapies versus normal medicines? So I'm going to show you some flags here, and if they're pointing left, it means that the economics are less favorable for cell and gene therapies. If they're going right, it means they're more favorable. So in terms of the R&D cost, I would argue that in total, it's quite similar for cell and gene therapies versus normal medicines. However, on a per patient basis, it's much higher for cell and gene therapies. And the only reason on average it's about the same, in aggregate it's the same, is because for the moment at least, most of cell and gene therapies are being developed in rare diseases. So you'll have smaller studies, and the size of the study matters for the total cost of R&D. But the per patient cost in those studies can easily be 5 or 10 times higher than for a small molecule treatment, because of the complexity of doing those studies, the requirement for expert centers and expert staff to undertake those studies. Manufacturing and supply of cell and gene therapies is much more challenging and much less scalable and more efficient than the equivalent for small or large molecule medicines. And this is perhaps one of the biggest ways in which the economics are quite profoundly different for these medicines versus normal medicines. Historically, a small molecule product, vast amount of cost in developing it and bringing it to market. But then when they're approved, you often have quite good margins that you can manufacture them relatively efficiently. And then the economics all stacks up over the life cycle. With cell and gene therapies, you still have the risk of and the challenge and the cost of developing them. But then when you're actually manufacturing them and trying to distribute them to patients, the level of cost is much, much higher. And as a consequence, the sorts of margins that the companies make, even at relatively high prices, are much lower for cell and gene therapies than they are for more conventional medicines. The risk of the probability of successfully developing a cell and gene therapy versus a conventional medicine, I mean, the literature is quite thin, but it suggests that they're probably comparable, i.e. they're both very risky. And then, as I say, at the moment, at least for cell and gene therapies, they're being used in small populations, and that's really tough on economics. The economics of rare disease medicines are really hard, primarily because they're treating small populations, and that's very obvious, but it still needs to be stated. And with cell and gene therapies, not only are you treating small populations, but often they're being further constrained within those labeled population due to either practical constraints or payer constraints. So really the number of treated patients can be very low. The price per treatment is higher, as I think we've all seen. If you look at the list price of a gene therapy, it could easily be 1 million or more euros per patient, which is obviously much higher than medicines have been previously. However, they are one-off therapies, and what is different is that you're only treating the patient, at least ideally, just the once. Whereas for existing, say, rare disease medicines, a patient might receive that therapy for a decade, continuously dosed medicine for a rare chronic disease. It's quite possible that, as I say, multiple years. And so the question of how that balance weighs up between the cost for one-off versus the annual cost for a continuous therapy is quite contentious as to whether we're seeing a similar willingness to pay from payers for one-off therapies versus continuously dosed therapies. So in aggregate, I would argue that the situation for cell and gene therapies economically is more challenging than for conventional medicines in populous conditions. It's probably more challenging also than for conventional medicines in small populations, mainly because of the challenges which are inherent in the investment required to develop the manufacturing and distribution channels, and the sheer cost that's required to bring these products to patients, irrespective of the continued high cost of development, high risk of development that we see with all medicines. So I'll conclude from my perspective in terms of what I think the implications of this are. I think as long as the economics look as they do from a European perspective, I think there's a risk that we're going to see innovation curtailed to niche populations, in particular sort of higher income countries. And there's a very real risk that we don't see sort of the widespread adoption and introduction of these therapies that could really have sort of a public health impact, because the economics are so marginal at the moment. It's really hard to see their ability to sort of scale them up and potentially come into sort of bigger populations at lower price points. And obviously that would be extremely sad if that potential wasn't realized. In order for us to get through sort of next decade of products which are going to be primarily autologous, and we do need to see, I think, two sort of areas of policy response. One on the cost side, on the supply side. There are constraints, regulatory constraints on how companies manufacture these products that constrain their ability to refine the process without having to do further studies to prove that hasn't impacted the effectiveness of them, and that they're legitimate concerns. But what we've seen, say, with large molecule medicines in the past is that the cost of manufacturing them would come down significantly over time. At the moment, it's hard to see that happening with cell and gene therapies, and that needs to happen if we're going to be able to use them for large populations. And then on the demand side, on the revenue side, there needs to be continued support from payers. The pricing has to be aligned with the equivalent of rare disease products and continuous medicines. The full value has to be recognized, and we have to realize that there needs to be a margin if the companies are going to continue to invest in these products in bigger indications. I'll stop there and happy to take questions when we get to that point.